Good morning. I'm Ed Gabriel, President of the American Task Force on Lebanon, and welcome to this webinar co-sponsored by the Middle East Institute and the American Task Force on Lebanon. Today's session will focus on the US-Lebanon policy brief, co-authored by 20 Lebanon, US-Lebanon policy experts as part of an ongoing Lebanon Working Group. This brief, which is the fifth in a series, is entitled US-Lebanon Relations, Setting a New International Framework for a More Responsive Government. Today's session will kick off with remarks from the State Department Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Near East, Ethan Goldrich, followed by Mary Ellen Richardson, Director of Legislative Affairs for Congressman Darren LaHood, who is co-chair of the House U.S. Lebanon Friendship Caucus. I'll then moderate a panel of distinguished policy experts who participated in the publication of this latest policy brief. Let me just start off by mentioning an article I read recently that said that in 1963, Lebanon was the fourth wealthiest country in the world. Today, it's among the four worst in terms of economic well-being. What a statement. Lebanon, as you know, is on the verge of failure. We believe that a new global framework is needed, led by the United States and its allies, to incentivize better governance in Lebanon. We also believe that Lebanon's political leaders must agree on a reform-oriented and corruption-free president committed to addressing the needs of the people of Lebanon. But I have to say, without U.S., French, and Gulf leadership speaking with one voice, we don't believe achieving this goal in the short term will happen without much difficulty. And let us not forget that a new president will determine the direction of Lebanon for the next 6 years or even more. In this regard, Senators Bob Menendez and Jim Risch, chair and ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, were right to call on the Biden administration to use all of its tools at its disposal, including sanctions, to pressure Lebanon's leaders to elect a clean and capable president and to form a government. A companion letter was just sent this week to the Biden administration, co-signed by the chairs of the US-Lebanon Friendship Caucus, Debbie Dingell, Daryl Issa, and Darren LaHood. So let's face it, corrupt Lebanese leaders have no one to blame but themselves for this Ponzi scheme, which is causing immense suffering among the Lebanese people. And they continue to delay rather than act. As everyone tuned into this webinar knows, time is running out, probably has run out. All sectors in Lebanon are suffering. The largest university in the country, the Lebanese University, doesn't even have enough money to buy paper to administer exams. And the two American universities, AUB and LAU, struggle to even maintain a competitive salary for their teaching staff. The Levant energy deal with Egypt and Jordan can more than double the electricity Lebanese households receive daily. But you know, there's a need for the US and Lebanon to work together with the World Bank to finalize the deal. And of course, support for the Lebanese Armed Forces is one of the strongest bipartisan areas of agreement in the Middle East. But in order to maintain the security and territorial integrity of the country, livelihood support from the international community is vital to support the LAF families during this crisis. So let me just end with one point. The maritime agreement between Lebanon and Israel is a great example of what the US can accomplish in Lebanon and the region. The US has proven that with this level of engagement and with our partners in Europe and the Gulf, we can help Lebanon save itself today and build a strong foundation for tomorrow. So with that, let me introduce State Department Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Near East region, Ethan Goldrich, who will provide opening comments. I should mention that Das Goldrich has worked tirelessly on behalf of US-Lebanon Relations and has generously given his time to address all matters Lebanon with members of the Lebanon Working Group and the Lebanese American community at large. Ethan, thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Ambassador Gabriel, and good morning to the esteemed panelists and to all those who are listening in. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk with you as you begin the discussion on this important and timely policy brief. We're sincerely grateful for the expertise that both the ATFL and the MEI bring to identifying policy solutions to Lebanon's multiple overlapping crises. After reading your latest publication, US-Lebanon Relations, Setting a New International Framework for a More Responsive Government, it is clear that we share many of the same concerns about Lebanon's trajectory. Decades of poor governance, economic mismanagement, and rampant corruption have left Lebanon ill-prepared to deal with the current crises and have only compounded the suffering of the Lebanese people. Parliament's failure to elect a president has made matters worse. Absent a functioning executive, implementing critical economic reforms will prove even more difficult. But there is room for optimism. As Ambassador Gabriel mentioned, Lebanon's conclusion of a historic maritime boundary agreement last fall demonstrated what its leaders can achieve if they work together to put the interests of the country first. As your policy brief underscores, now is the time to capitalize on the agreement's momentum. Lebanon's leaders must bring that same sense of unity, energy, and purpose to the critical task of rescuing the economy and stabilizing the country. With these aims in mind, the Biden administration has developed a series of policy priorities aimed at supporting Lebanon and its people. First, we and our partners in the international community must continue to press for presidential elections and subsequent government formation, both of which are critical to making progress on much needed reforms. Now, some have claimed that Lebanon will not and cannot do so without foreign intervention. As we have made clear both privately and publicly, it is for the Lebanese parliament to determine the next president in accordance with the demands of the Lebanese people. We, US government, are not in the business of picking winners and losers. We can only say that Lebanon needs a president free of corruption, who can unite the country, put the interests of Lebanon's people first, and implement critical economic reforms, which brings me to our next priority, securing an IMF program. It remains Lebanon's best and only realistic option toward long-term recovery. To date, however, Lebanon's leaders have made only limited progress toward meeting the IMF's reform conditions. While we stand ready to assist Lebanon in implementing these reforms, we and our partners in the international community must convey that there is no substitute for an IMF program, and there will be no bailout. We are also mindful of the daily hardships the Lebanese people face as their leaders struggle to address these crises. For too long, Lebanon's corruption-saddled energy sector has failed to provide for its people, who receive just a handful of hours of state-generated power a day. The US government remains committed to identifying sustainable energy solutions for Lebanon and its people, including via World Bank financed regional energy deals, which is a priority for this administration. The ball remains in the Lebanese government's court. We continue to urge Lebanese leaders to complete the bank's required reform conditions for these deals and remain closely engaged with all stakeholders. As these crises compound, we are also clear-eyed about the threat Hezbollah continues to pose to Lebanon, the United States, and to the broader region. We will continue to use the range of tools at our disposal to undercut this threat. For example, in fall of 2022, we imposed sanctions on a range of individuals and entities for providing financial services to Hezbollah. At the same time, we designated a major smuggling network responsible for diverting profits from illicit Iranian oil to Hezbollah's coffers. Indeed, combating Hezbollah's influence and shoring up Lebanon's stability and security remain key objectives for this administration. Regarding the security sector, the continued operational readiness and troop morale of the Lebanese Armed Forces and internal security forces are critical to preventing a worst-case scenario in Lebanon. Since 2006, we have provided more than $3 billion in material, equipment, supplies, and training directly to both services. We continue to explore further security sector support and call on Lebanon's friends in the international community to do the same. Lastly, we remain deeply grateful for Lebanon's generosity in hosting refugees, even as we are mindful of the strains that doing so places on the country's increasingly limited resources. While we understand the frustration some in Lebanon feel, we remain concerned that the rhetoric from some Lebanese officials could inspire violence and further undermine the country's stability. The United States does not oppose the voluntary return of refugees, including those facilitated by the Lebanese government, so long as those returns are closely coordinated with UNHCR to ensure adequate notice and full transparency. For large-scale returns to become a reality, however, the situation in Syria must change. Only the Assad regime can create conditions for safe, voluntary, and dignified returns by engaging in the political process in good faith. In closing, we sincerely appreciate the opportunity to engage on these critical issues. Although the proposals we will hear about today do not in themselves constitute US policy, we are grateful for your recommendations and look forward to discussing in depth. Now, I've taken up too much of our time already. We prefer to hear from you, the experts, as we explore ways to bolster the US-Lebanon relationship in support of the Lebanese people. So thank you everyone for your time, and let's get going.
Ethan, I just want to say thank you for your contribution and your dedication to the United States of America and the work you do at the State Department, and for really making sure that Lebanon stays on the map as we address many issues that you are faced with in the region in the United States. Thank you very much. Our next opening remarks is from Mary Ellen Richardson, who is the staff lead recently in a staff congressional delegation trip that ATFL sponsored to Lebanon. Mary Ellen led that trip. She also is a leader in the House as she staffs the US-Lebanon Friendship Caucus, and she's done a remarkable job there. Mary Ellen, we look forward to your comments and kind of what you saw on your visit to Lebanon and from your own point of view. Thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Gabriel, and to ATFL, MEI, and others for helping to arrange this conversation around the recent policy proposals this morning. And I'm glad to be with you all today and the panelists. As Ambassador Gabriel mentioned previously, I'm the legislative director for Congressman Darren LaHood, who proudly represents Central and Northwestern Illinois and is a Lebanese American. His family immigrated to the United States from Aitu, a small town in northern Lebanon, and we represent a very large and active Lebanese diaspora community in Peoria, Illinois. Congressman LaHood, as was mentioned, serves as the co-chair of the bipartisan US-Lebanon Friendship Caucus, along with Congressman Issa and Congresswoman Dingell. And the caucus, which last Congress had about 35 bipartisan members from across the country, is a wonderful platform for members and congressional staff to better understand and engage the issues happening in and around Lebanon and the region and the issues facing Lebanese people. The caucus just briefly hosts briefings, meetings with US officials, visiting Lebanese officials and diaspora groups, introduces typically a bipartisan House resolution expressing the sense of Congress on issues surrounding the Lebanese people, and also helps educate members on appropriations funding tools, issues around our support for the Lebanese Armed Forces, the universities in Lebanon, including AUB and LAU, and our other US humanitarian funding efforts. As Ambassador Gabriel mentioned, the caucus co-chairs have visited Lebanon at least twice over the last several Congresses, and myself and other staff were privileged recently to travel with ATFL to Lebanon in October of last year. Our staff trip to Lebanon provided invaluable firsthand experience on the humanitarian challenges facing the people of Lebanon, issues around energy and sanitation, a view into the ongoing stalemate to elect a president, the significant value of the ongoing US support for the independent Lebanese Armed Forces, and the challenges of the refugee crisis. The trip also highlighted the energy and resilience of many in Lebanon who we saw are working hard to continue the goal and the energy that was put forward in the recent parliamentary elections to have a representative government that will truly serve the needs of the Lebanese people and not outside actors. We also had the opportunity to be in Lebanon at a historic moment during the signing of the Maritime Border Agreement with Israel. Trips like this provide invaluable insight and help informing staff and members of the importance and the direct impact of continued congressional engagement. This in turn helps us articulate the need to continue this support through tools we have in Congress, including legislation, appropriations funding, letters to the administration, or other mechanisms to our colleagues in Congress who aren't as familiar or focused on issues surrounding Lebanon. We sincerely appreciate ATFL for all of their work in hospitality in hosting our trip and look forward to continuing to work on issues surrounding Lebanon. With the start of the 118th Congress, we'll be reforming the caucus and are hopeful to engage many new and returning members on a myriad of policy issues related to Lebanon. And I believe there's a real educational opportunity for new members and others in Congress to understand the nuance and the history of the US-Lebanon relationship. And I'm hopeful many on this webinar today will be able to support our efforts by encouraging their members of Congress to stay engaged on these issues and perhaps even travel to Lebanon to learn firsthand as we did. Thank you again, Ambassador Gabriel. I won't take up too much more of your time as I know we want to hear from the panelists, but appreciate the opportunity for being able to address the group today and look forward to working on Lebanon this Congress.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. We look forward to you leading another delegation in the future to Lebanon. As you know, things, the more they change, the more they stay the same, but we learn every time we go there. And I think it helps us when we come back and advocate for good US policy. Thank you again for being with us. I'd now like to turn to our distinguished panel made up of four US-Lebanon policy experts. Paul Salem, the president of the Middle East Institute and the co-sponsor of this today's event. Moni Yakubian, senior advisor to the Executive Office in the Middle East and North Africa Center, at the US Institute of Peace. Brian Katula, senior fellow and vice president for policy at the Middle East Institute, and David Hale, global fellow at the Wilson Center and former US undersecretary at the State Department. Welcome. We look forward to getting into our discussion. So we've heard from two branches of the government, Paul, I'm going to maybe just throw out some questions to each one of you, and that'll be followed by hopefully public Q&A from the webinar participants. If they have a question, they should go to the bottom of their screen to Q&A and ask it. But Paul, let me ask a few questions of you all, and starting with you. Let's talk about the current political standoff in Lebanon and the importance of the election of a president. As we said before, and I think I'm quoting you actually, the next president will determine the future of Lebanon for the next 6 years or more. What can the U.S. and its allies do to ensure they elect a clean and capable leader for Lebanon, and hopefully in the short term? Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Gabriel, and welcome to everybody who's joining us. No doubt the country is in the middle of a constitutional vacuum without a president and without a functioning government. And that, as I think Mr. Goldrich pointed out, is something that does not enable Lebanon to take even minimal steps that it needs to do urgently on economic reform, on addressing the IMF requirements, reaching out to friends and allies of Lebanon to try to start an economic recovery, let alone build on the Lebanon-Israel Maritime Agreement to move forward quickly on exploration on the offshore gas issue. But let's also put things in context. The state and the economy is in a very, very dire situation. Electing a president, I'll get to that, of course, is important, but the damage cannot be undone very quickly. At the highest level, the country remains lacking of sovereignty. Hezbollah is a completely sovereign, in its sense, organization that answers to the Islamic Republic of Iran and has its own defense, intelligence, foreign policy, and continues to cripple any capacity of the Lebanese state or indeed the Lebanese people to determine that fate. Is it significant that even the Iranian younger generation is challenging that whole trajectory? Maybe over time that will be significant. We will not fool ourselves that no president, no government is going to be able to reverse that very crippling situation that Hezbollah creates in the country. Secondly, the extent of the collapse of the economy, of the banking system, of the public finances is a loss of several decades of economic growth, of banking credit accumulation, of public finances. And again, no president, no government is going to repair that quickly. The best that can be hoped for is a slowing the decline and beginning a recovery. Just today, the Lebanese pound hit a new high of 50,000 to the Lebanese dollar. As you recall, Ed, many years ago, used to be 3 pounds to the Lebanese dollar many years ago, and then it stabilized at 1,500 for 3 decades. And now it's at 50,000 and counting. 80% of the population is in poverty. The government budget, which used to be around $16-17 billion, is now the equivalent of about $1 billion, which means that although the state in theory continues to exist, in effect, its muscle, its sinews, its capacity to operate is extremely paralyzed. The Lebanese army is one of the most important institutions that keeps the country together. Support from the US and other countries to that institution is very, very significant in keeping the country from completely collapsing into chaos and different forms of militia and cantonization and militia warfare. Now getting to the election of a president, the president of Lebanon does have a solid 6-year term, so it casts a long shadow between now and 2029. The president has a role in formation of government. He has a role in sort of politics in general. So it is a very significant decision. And it's important at this juncture that the international community not interfere, but use its legitimate leverage that Lebanon needs help from the international community. The international community can legitimately say, well, we have conditions, like the IMF has conditions. And that should include, as you indicated, Ambassador Gabriel, as the paper makes clear, the international community, both in the West and the Arab countries, should make clear that at a very minimum, the president has to be clean and has to have an independent, fairly nationalist position. We cannot afford 6 more years of a corrupt and client administration that works basically hand in hand with Hezbollah. What's in front of us is a presidential election. It's important that that be done fairly quickly. Lebanon cannot afford 2 or 2.5 years of presidential vacancy and government paralysis. Now, keep in mind that a lot of the politicians which were returned to parliament, a lot of them are part of what you'd have to call a criminal gang. This is not only a criminal gang that has presided over the biggest theft of people's money in any country in history. They have also presided over effectively a port explosion which killed thousands and destroyed a large part of the capital, and prevented as a criminal gang any serious investigation of this historic crime. So we can't fool ourselves that a president is going to change the situation overnight, but the international community should use its leverage to get a better option rather than a worse option. When I look a little bit longer term, I'm hopeful that the Lebanese public is active. There has been, an activity and uprising that began in 2019. It had some results in the parliamentary elections of 2022. There could be more results, hopefully in the upcoming local elections and then the parliamentary elections of 2026. So I have some hope that the Lebanese population has awakened to the critical need for it to be much more engaged. I'm also hopeful that perhaps over time the situation from Iran maybe might change. I'm hopeful that the maritime deal with Israel will enable Lebanon to access offshore gas resources, which will be important for electricity production and economic investment in Lebanon. And as Lebanon would need to reach out to the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, which includes regional players as well as European partners in the US, to export any gas, I hope that that too would push Lebanon in a more integrated international and regional direction. So step 1 is electing an effective president. Step 2 is using leverage as well to, after that, have an effective prime minister and government in place and get to work to stop the slide and begin a slow recovery. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Paul. A quick follow-up. It's rumored that Qatar, Saudi, French, and Americans will meet maybe the end of the month or early next month to put their heads together on Lebanon. What is it that you hope they can get done?
Well, I think it's expressed well in the paper that what is in front of us is step 1 is a presidential election. Some of the candidates some of the candidates that have put forward, I think, would be a very negative candidacy in terms of corruption and clientship to Hezbollah and the Assad regime and Iran. That is not in Lebanon's interest. I think other candidates, without getting into details, have a much better profile. I think, of course, this is a Lebanese decision and must remain so. But as I said, as Lebanon needs regional and international help, it has to listen to the outside, and the outside has something to say about it. And the outside also has an interest in Lebanon not falling deeper into chaos and collapse, because that would have effects on security in the Levant, security in the Eastern Mediterranean, refugee flows to Europe. So it is also an issue of international concern. So I hope if there is such a meeting of the so-called quartet, that they would speak in one voice. They would be very clear. They don't need to name names. But this opportunity, which will cast a shadow over the next 6 years, must not be ignored and must not be allowed to fail.
Thanks, Paul. Any comments before we go on? Anybody want to add anything? Well, okay. I'll next go to David Hale. David, I wanted to bring up the issue of sanctions and challenges that the Biden administration has to focus on Lebanon, given all of its foreign affairs issues. Lebanon in the next year is going to be faced with a lot. Can the U.S. stay focused on it? Also, there's a clear demand for sanctions by most of the actors we talk to. And they say not only should they be sanctioned for harboring terrorism, but, for abuse of human rights and being corrupt. Why aren't these guys being sanctioned? And I have a follow-up question, which would be, is anybody on that list, do you think, that is exempt from that list because they're so-called helping the United States? So those two questions generally.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. And thank you for bringing us together and for all the great work on this report and everything else that ATFL and MEI do. I think Ethan outlined some of the challenges and the way in which the Biden administration looks at the challenges in the relationship. I would only add really two observations. One is that often, whether this is ideal or not, American policy toward Lebanon is derivative of its policies toward other events and relationships in the region. And I think the nature of how we approach Lebanon will be, and the success of our approach to Lebanon will be influenced by the way in which we factor that into our approach to Iran. And we can come back to that if you like. The second observation I would make is, and again, this is analysis, not a desire on my part, but I anticipate a wave of normalization toward the Assad regime in Syria. If that assessment is correct, then we're likely to see the issue of refugees become an even higher priority, with raised expectations that the international community will be doing something to help relieve the burden of the refugees on the neighboring countries, including Lebanon. And so I think, and I hope that all the people who have the right tools are thinking about how can we, if that moment comes, what are we doing to incentivize the voluntary, safe return of refugees? And so I think that's something I would hope the administration will be addressing, because it will come. On your question about sanctions, sanctions are a favorite instrument of foreign policy in Washington, have been for years, more so in recent years, particularly as the use of military pressure becomes less and less popular. But I would, and no one who in Washington is going to argue against sanctions. I'm not certainly going to argue against sanctions, but I would ask that people think about how effective the application of sanctions as we are currently doing them really is. Because sanctions is not an end in itself. It is a policy instrument, and its success or failure is dependent upon really the larger policy construct. Sanctions can be a highly effective tool in supporting those policies, but in other ways it can be a symbol of our virtue, important values that we want to show, without necessarily expecting it's really going to change behavior. But we have to take a stand. And that is perfectly defensible as well, but we have to understand the limitations of that. And a perfect example, frankly, or actually a very bad example, but it proves this point, is that we've had very comprehensive sanctions on Hezbollah for 25 years. When the first law was passed, it enabled us to sanction not just states, but entities for terrorism. And I don't think anyone here would argue that Hezbollah has been weakening during this 25-year period. Paul put it very eloquently where Hezbollah is today. That's not our fault. And it may have been even worse without the sanctions. But I don't believe that we have effectively figured out how we can deal with Iranian supplied weapons and Hezbollah's strength. And sanctions alone are not doing it. And we need to recognize that reality. Again, not an argument against doing the sanctions, but an argument for thinking about how effective we can be. I would also point out that, and another example is, obviously sanctioning corrupt people is something who would argue against, but is it part of a larger strategy? Are we doing something that is going to build the institutions of the state so it shuts down the pools where corruption is able to feed? In terms of state service sectors where the corruption is rampant, and are there law enforcement mechanisms in the state of Lebanon that are going after corruption? And are we doing everything we can to build up those law enforcement institutions and making perhaps our assistance to them a part of that? And so that you have the negative element of sanctions, the pressure, but is there another element where we're building a context which we can change the environment, because without that second part, the first part will just be simple one-offs, which may be easy to defend, but is not achieving the goal that you want to achieve. The last point I would make is, on this point is really twofold. One is we need to make sure that we battle any misperceptions that American sanctions are contributing to the economic problems of Lebanon. They have not. They have been very narrowly tailored. That has nothing to do with the financial collapse or the financial crisis in the banking sector and so forth. But our propagandistic opponents are trying to make that case. And so we have to be very clear about that as we proceed. And second is we have to avoid enabling a retribution game where certain Lebanese who have access to American officials can provide names when they have actually their own interests in mind rather than necessarily the policy goals that the United States has in mind, which is where Treasury's vetting is very important. And I've always been impressed by that. But I would come back to where I started, which is what I learned in government is we're very good at applying sanctions. We are not very good at measuring their effectiveness. Now we can determine the numbers of energy units that are not loaded in Iran and so forth and so on. But are we changing the behavior that sanctions are designed to do? And that, I think, needs a closer look each and every time we embark on a sanctions avenue.
So thank you, David. Let me just do a follow-up, see if Brian or others want to respond. What is it that we can do on the outside in the Lebanon Working Group to really make sure Lebanon remains a focus of the administration? Brian, do you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. I think first, Ed, thanks to you and our friends over at ATFL for keeping Lebanon on the radar screen and building and maintaining a bipartisan consensus of support for the people of Lebanon. So I think a lot of what's being done, I think, is important. I think maybe a key thing in voicing these recommendations on policy is to remind everyone and various audiences that Lebanon is a very complicated country with really wonderful people who deserve better. Paul and you, Ambassador Hale, essentially said this, but we often get stuck in the moment that we can't get out of in the Middle East and in Lebanon as well. And Lebanon itself is in a moment where it's essentially held hostage by a lot of its political classes and leaders. And it's not for Americans or outside groups like ours to decide what the future leadership of Lebanon should look like, but it's important, I think, to give voice to the millions of ordinary Lebanese people who just want something different. And we saw glimmers of that in the last election. But for certain, if you look at the multiple attempts to try to form a new government in Lebanon and the cast of characters who seem sort of the same and more of the same, it's I think a desire for change. So I think giving voice and to the idea of there's a possibility for a different Lebanon and a different future. Right now, it rests largely in the hands of the political classes, but communicating to people, and you do this all the time, but even more here in America and other places, that the Lebanese people are not, they should not be held hostage by their leaders, and that they deserve people who can address not only the political divisions, but also the substantial economic problems, as the report articulates.
Thank you. Something you brought up, I think, is a good opening for Mona. And just before I go to Mona, I want to remind people that they can submit questions at the bottom of the screen under Q&A. And also, if you'd like a copy of the report, they're available on either one of our websites, MEI.org, I believe, or ATFL.org. You can find, and it's 8 or 10 pages, including a 2-page summary. Mona,
it's MEI.edu, just to be precise.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah, I should have known. Thank you, Paul. The importance of humanitarian economic development aid, Mona. We all agree the U.S. should have a hard line when it comes to ensuring that no aid goes to the Lebanese government without significant reforms. But as Brian alluded to, this can hurt the most innocent, the most vulnerable, the poor, civil society, those that deserve not to suffer from this. what should America's role, maybe its obligation, be with under this kind of policy?
Thanks so much, Ed, and thanks to ATFL and MEI for your leadership on this really important effort, which I think has done a tremendous job of keeping Lebanon on the agenda. Picking up on the points that have been made, I think you're going to hear a theme here, which is, I think it's critical for the US to make a distinction between a corrupt political class in Lebanon that is in effect holding the country hostage at enormous human cost, and the Lebanese people. So Paul raised the idea, the Lebanese, with this stalemate, with this continued inaction, we are seeing the continued deterioration of humanitarian conditions in the country. When the Lebanese lira continues to plummet now to a new low, as Paul notes, of 50,000 lira to the dollar, that has enormous humanitarian implications, right? That provokes the triple-digit inflation, growing impoverishment. Paul rightly notes 80% of the Lebanese people live below the poverty line. I'll add one more statistic, which is it's projected that 42% of the Lebanese people will be experiencing acute or emergency levels of food insecurity. Lebanon is now in the top 10 most food insecure countries in the world, which is astounding when we consider that this was once a solidly middle-income country. And these changes have enormous structural impacts. Children are being unduly affected. 42% of Lebanese children suffer from food insecurity. And we're seeing ways in which this growing impoverishment leads to what we call negative coping strategies. Children being pulled from school and being forced to work in order to contribute to family income, early child marriage. All of these things affect Lebanon's development, Lebanon's stability. And this is where I think the US comes in an important way. And the report highlights this of providing humanitarian assistance to Lebanon. The United States has distinguished itself around the world as being a leader, a leading donor of humanitarian assistance, and Lebanon is no exception. I believe the US is the leading donor of humanitarian assistance. It was noted that it also elevating Lebanon on the agenda with the visit of USAID Administrator Samantha Power to Lebanon late last year. She announced at that time additional food assistance to Lebanon. What I would say, though, it's critical, as the report notes, that this stay on the agenda because there are competing demands with the war in Ukraine, with climate change. The humanitarian needs around the world are growing. And so it's essential that Lebanon stay on the radar and that the US continues to provide adequate humanitarian assistance to Lebanon, but that's not enough. I think what we also need to see is that the aid community, the US assistance community, rethink how we view Lebanon. The statistics that we just laid out are not the statistics of a middle-income country. Aid, to its credit, has now, I believe, assigned a permanent humanitarian assistance advisor to the mission in Beirut. That's really important. I also think more needs to be done. The report rightly highlights the need to continue our funding for Lebanese education, and that's huge, both the public education system at the primary level as well as universities like AUB and LAU. At the same time, though, I think we need to perhaps pivot a bit our assistance and start to get at this food insecurity issue. So think about how to promote better local agriculture and ways in which the Lebanese can begin to provide, because Lebanon imports quite a bit of its food. So there are ways to sort of promote and build capacities locally, which I think ultimately is the most sustainable way forward for a country like Lebanon. And then lastly, I think it's really important, and ATFL is a tremendous example of this, also Congressman Lahoud and the bipartisan Lebanese American Friendship Caucus, to continue to work with the diaspora to see the extent to which the diaspora can play more of a role in helping to provide resources and assistance to their brethren in Lebanon. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mona, very much. It's kind of sad because what you're defining almost is Lebanon has become a beggar state. Shame on those leaders for where it is today, but hopefully the United States and we all can make a difference in the year ahead. Brian, let's turn to you next on regional security. And then if you could also weave in the importance of the LAF to U.S. interests, maybe those two topics. There's a number of questions already on
Sure.
that, on the
Sure,
LAF.
great. Thanks, Ed. First, maybe just to supplement what Ambassador Hale had said in terms of U.S. engagement and the Biden administration, I see 2022, the previous year, as the year when, for overall U.S. strategy in the Middle East, it was President Biden's Michael Corleone moment. Just when he thought he was out, he gets pulled back in. And in part, it was a consequence of the effects of Russia's war on Ukraine and multiple dynamics. But as you highlighted and others in our report does, a key feature of that engagement wasn't just Biden's visit last summer to Israel and Saudi Arabia. It was this intensive diplomacy that led to the important Lebanon-Israel agreement. So that sort of engagement, I hope, continues, and I know continues. But as others have said, it's hard for any administration to prioritize all of these issues when the world's afire with a number of things beyond Ukraine war, as well as China's rise. On the LAF and Lebanon's peace and the regional security, we all need to remember that the Middle East still remains in a very fragile state systemically. The regional security system still suffers from a number of failed and failing states, and I would include Lebanon in that, on the border of facing collapse and a lot of challenges from within. So when I hear, and I've heard talk in the new Congress here, and there was some noise last year in some of the think tanks talking about the need to cut off funding for the Lebanese Armed Forces, it's exactly the opposite thing that's needed at this moment. And I'll say a few words why. But when I heard those words, it seems as reckless and careless as the slogans we hear here in the United States, or we heard over the last few years of defund the police, right? And why that's reckless is that any basic society needs law and order and needs institutions that actually help preserve and protect it. And certainly those institutions shouldn't be given a blank check to do what it wants, and there should be rules and authorities. But when you look at the case of Lebanon, it is essential for institutions like the LAF to continue to receive support, because it does so many things. It's a key actor in helping prevent threats from within, and then regional threats from spiraling out of control. And the last thing we need in the Middle East right now is even more complicated security dynamics. LAF, in essence, is about, I think, 80,000 or so strong. But an important part of it, in addition to its essential role it plays in law and order and security, is the role that it plays in countering or trying to counter some terrorist threats. It's a complicated dynamic in Lebanon these days, because part of the political classes that are keeping or holding the people hostage, of course, is Lebanese Hezbollah, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the main point is, when I've heard talk, and we'll see what happens in the new U.S. House of Representatives, in the deal that Kevin McCarthy brokered, in essence, with some who, in parts of the negotiations, there were reports that overall there was a demand to cut funding from the top line of what U.S. support and security support would be. I think there's enough bipartisan support in Congress to prevent this from happening. But to be clear, it would be disastrous to cut that support off to the Lebanese Armed Forces, because they're essentially the glue, a key part of the glue that's keeping the society together. Yes, there's more things that the leadership in the Council of Ministers and in the defense sectors in Lebanon can do to advance a more coherent national defense strategy. And absolutely, as you've said, Ed, and others, that the political leadership in Lebanon, who understands this vital support that comes from the U.S., that's why they should pay close attention to what's happening in this new Congress, because there will be more people asking tougher questions about where money is going to and to which institutions. And I think the thrust of the report we put out highlights, I think, the core point of needing to provide that support, but make it conditional in the sense of performance on many of the key sectors. But in my estimation, the LAF has been performing quite well in maintaining the law and order. Last thing I'd say, just to close out my contribution on this, is that related to some of the things that were said before and what I just said about the support for the LAF, a key part of what I think needs to be done by the United States, and this is more a job for the State Department or the White House, is to speak about the role that the US plays in Lebanon and to counter the narratives that the Iranian-backed and Hezbollah-backed propaganda, so-called resistance narrative that blames the suffering of the Lebanese people on the United States somehow, perversely, right? And this is where America's voice, I think, is essential and is often quite muted or not as clear in those broader battles for a variety of reasons. But I think we need US officials to make as clear as possible who's to blame for the current predicament. And it's not the lack of US support in any case, as Mona and others have talked about. It's actually the dysfunction of the country's leadership and then key factions in that leadership that hold the Lebanese people back.
Thank you, Brian. Very good. I should say that if Mary Ellen were on the call right now, she would remind us that when we visited with US embedded troops in Lebanon, they were very clear in stating that this was, in their opinion, the best US investment in a military in the region, and that they had met all the markers that DoD has as expectations. We all know it's the only functioning institution left in Lebanon. And let me just also on our behalf thank Ambassador Shea for her work to make sure there is a livelihood account set up through the UN to help the families right now during this particular tough crisis. Mona, you might want to comment on the regional aspects, or we can move on to other questions.
No, I mean, I fully agree with Brian's analysis and Ambassador Hale as well. I do think we're seeing a region that is in the midst of lots of change, and the impacts of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how that's shifting the regional power dynamics is only just beginning to play out. I think that does indeed have implications for Lebanon. This might be a lead into our topic on refugees, but I fully agree with Ambassador Hale's assessment that we're going to see an increasing trend toward normalization with the Assad regime. And that in turn is going to put quite a bit of pressure on Syrian refugees, including those in Lebanon, to be returned back to Syria. And unfortunately, as long as the Assad, I think Das Goldrich made this point quite well, as long as Bashar al-Assad is still in power in Lebanon, in Syria, that's a Freudian slip, there really will not be the conditions for large-scale, safe returns of refugees, and that has to remain a core sort of principle of how we think about the refugees in Lebanon. Look, you're on mute, Ed.
I figured it would happen once today. Well, we're on refugees. Let's just talk about it. You know, we sensed on our last trip that there's a growing frustration by all the Lebanese across the board, it seems, as an untenable situation. And my question to you is, what are our options staying within legal UN mandates and laws, which we want to? What are the options out there? What can we do more? What are some of the thoughts you have with regard to the refugees? Because I don't think it's sustainable long term.
Yeah, no, listen, it's an enormous challenge. Let's be real. Given the suffering that the Lebanese people themselves are enduring, I will say it's important to note Syrian refugees living in Lebanon are also living under very, very dire conditions. More than 90% of them live in extreme poverty. But it's also understandable that Lebanon has for now 12 years hosted among the highest proportion of per capita of Syrian refugees. in the world. And so this is an enormous, I think the report rightly points out, this is a global public good that Lebanon provides to the international community. And it's incumbent on the international community, on the assistance, humanitarian, continue to provide the assistance to help support not just Syrian refugees, but the Lebanese communities who host them, and in particular to ensure that vulnerable Lebanese also are receiving adequate humanitarian assistance. I think the report comes up with a terrific idea, which is to put together a study group to bring experts from across disciplines to really start to think through what are some of the actionable, creative solutions that we can come upon to help address this problem. The problem is well diagnosed, the solutions less so. And I continue to believe there are win-win solutions out there. I actually think it would be really interesting to bring both Lebanese and Syrian diaspora together. The example of, for example, the ways in which the Lebanese healthcare system is collapsing. The Syrian diaspora has pioneered in really fascinating ways of addressing medical issues through telehealth and other kinds of platforms. This is something that could also be transported and be done in Lebanon. It's not being done, as just one example. The other is, to what extent can the Syrian refugee population, as an important source of human capital in Lebanon, be catalyzed to help turn the country around, to help promote economic growth in the country. It's not a pipe dream. I think it's possible. And again, I commend the report for saying, let's really bring people together to study this and lift up some new ideas.
Thank you, Mona. And in our work in the report, we found also that more can be done to support the host communities as well. So we have a lot of work ahead of us in the study group, and I want to thank you for being such a lead in terms of helping us think through and how we steer that study group. Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question of Paul, and then we'll get into some of the 30+ questions that are on the board. Paul, the financial meltdown, Lebanon's energy crisis, the government doesn't have a consensus on the IMF. They don't seem to even care about developing a consensus. And I'm wondering if the deal is really dead. Can a consensus be built, do you think? And it seems that on the electricity issue that it could be fixed. I mean, countries deal with these kinds of issues every day. But unfortunately, some of these politicians are putting their interests ahead of good public policy. And then, of course, we've got the maritime deal and what that could do to afford a better energy program. And let me just bring up one last thing, decentralization. I think the more the villages and municipalities start to look at taking care of themselves, maybe starting with solar energy and garbage pickup and education, and maybe even civil society support would be helpful. But that's a whole can of ideas I throw at you, Paul.
Well, it's the case that the current, powers that be and the current power structure have not really moved effectively to address the needs to go forward with the IMF deal. But to be practical, that's the main question facing the next president and the next administration. And that's why we're saying in our report that this is a very critical juncture. And that there are more effective presidents and less effective presidents, more independent presidents and less independent presidents. So far, the reforms have not been put in place to implement the IMF deal. And let's not forget, the IMF deal doesn't only liberate funds from the IMF, but if Lebanon is in agreement with the IMF, that gives an international seal of approval for funds to be more forthcoming from Western countries, from countries in the Gulf. It would be the beginning of setting confidence. That needs to be one of the main demands, requirements, leverage points when the international community is addressing the parliament in its selection of the next president, and then addressing the president and the parliament in the selection of the next prime minister, that we are looking for the president, we are looking a prime minister who is openly, clearly committed and serious about implementing everything that needs to be done. We haven't seen that yet. I'm still a little bit hopeful because there actually is no other option for Lebanon. There's no non-IMF pathway to serious economic recovery. So I think sooner or later, whoever is in power, if they want to have a successful presidency or a successful prime ministership, they know there's no other way to do it. I have a bit of a fear that with the maritime agreement with Israel, some factions in the country, could be Hezbollah itself, and the ATFL movement and others might think, well, look, we have a deal with Israel. We're going to get gas in the next 5-6 years. Maybe that's enough. Maybe we can live as a corrupt petrostate like Iran is, like Nigeria, like other countries, without having to integrate with the international community and adhere to international rules. That's why the struggle for the presidency, for the government, is a real one. It's not just names. So that still is very much in the balance. Decentralization should have been implemented 30 years ago. It was a key component of the Taif agreement. The oligarchy that has ruled the country for the past 30 years has not wanted to do it because they want to control all deals, all money, all decision-making in Beirut. They don't want other power centers to emerge on the country. I think that should be and remain one of the Lebanese main demands for domestic reform going forward. There is a demand for the government to go ahead and set the date for the next local elections. They were postponed. They were supposed to happen last year. They shouldn't be postponed again. That is elections to 10,000 municipalities across the country. That's about 200,000 elected officials. So that's real political movement there, and that needs to be insisted upon by the Lebanese, and I would say by the international community as well. I do want to make a couple of comments about the dire refugee situation. No doubt it is extreme and it is dire, and the country and the communities are putting up with a lot. But a couple of things about it as well. Let's not fool ourselves. The refugee situation is not why our money in the banks was stolen. That was not stolen by the Syrian refugees. That was a Ponzi scheme set up by bankers and the central bank and the ruling oligarchy. And after the Ponzi scheme collapsed 2.5 years ago, at least Bernie Madoff in New York ended up in jail. There has been no accountability and no, any responsibility for the theft of $70 billion of people's savings that wasn't caused by the refugees. The collapse of the economy is not caused by the refugees, nor the currency, nor is the absence of Lebanese sovereignty. That is caused by Hezbollah, not by the Lebanese refugees. So we need to keep that in perspective. I'm very concerned about the future of the refugee situation, because if the situation in Lebanon is bad, the situation in Syria is even much worse. They have less of a functioning government. Their economic situation is, if anything, worse than the Lebanese situation. The country is not even, it's not united, as in the sense that it's not communicating within itself. It has a regime which is, in outright war with much of its own population. It is also a regime that doesn't control much of anything. So when one says, oh, normalize with the Assad regime doesn't run Syria. It has been overtaken by a criminal enterprise, criminal gang. The Syrian economy is basically now a narcotics production and export economy, making most of its hard currency from Captagon and other drugs. Iran has tremendous influence, Russia as well. So the Syrian state, as we knew it 20 years ago, is no longer there even to normalize with. It's a whole bunch of criminal organizations and really out of control. So that is very worrisome for countries like Lebanon, I dare say for countries like Turkey as well, who have millions of Syrian refugees there. But I do think what that means for policy, and it's not an easy lift, that for countries in the region and for the US, and at some point after the Ukraine, Russia, there needs to be found a way to move forward in Syria. Syria is like a Chernobyl reactor, which is poisoning the situation not only in Lebanon, but also in Turkey in Iraq and throughout the region. It cannot be left to fester for another 10 years. But how to get the Assad regime to begin to move forward, how to combat the narcotics trafficking that's going on, none of that is going to be easy. But Lebanon will not know more stability until Syria stabilizes a bit. To end a little bit on a positive note, I did mention that in the long term, the discovery of offshore gas will help the Lebanese economy, both to fuel its electricity and eventually to export gas to Europe. Secondly, at some point, reconstruction in Syria will begin to take, to move. And I think Lebanon will be a major staging point for any economic activity in Syria. That maybe is still many years in the future, but when we look 10 years down the road, I see somehow that's going to be coming forward. And as well, the maritime deal with Israel and the normalization that's taking place might also create economic benefits for Lebanon as well on the Eastern Mediterranean. Thank you, Ed.
Great. This has been a fantastic discussion. We have dozens of questions. Let me jump in and try to knock off a few of these. Maybe this goes to David and others who want to comment. How can we counter Hezbollah influence in Lebanon? What's the formula for doing that?
I think there are two avenues, primarily three avenues. One is to put a spotlight on the nonsense that there is something to resist anymore. And the maritime agreement helps enormously with that. In the long run, it shows that diplomacy can produce results that can deal with differences, border anomalies, and so forth, and that there is no Israeli occupation, therefore there is no resistance logic. Two, the American approach to Iran has to take into account, if it wishes to have any change in Hezbollah's status and behavior. If that is a US priority, then we have to have a priority in our approach to Iran. Third, in the long run, and this is painful, and people will say we've tried and it's not working, and there's some truth to that, but rebuilding the state of Lebanon is essential. And that means, in talking about the presidency, obviously I agree with everything that's been said, but you got to reach some level of consensus to get a president. And that means dealing with people that you don't agree with in order to reach that point. And we have to work with imperfect partners if we want to strengthen the central state of Lebanon. Back to you, Ed.
Thank you. So here's a question. I'm not sure who wants to take it, but since the IMF deal looks like it's flawed, why don't we take the $3 billion that they're offering, work with the World Bank, IMF, and other USAID, and just work out programs with the municipalities. Do a workaround program. Paul or Mona? Mona's smiling the most, so maybe we start with Mona. It's a serious question, by the way.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic. I totally sympathetic, but that's just not the way these deals are structured. You have to work through a sovereign government. But that being said, there is quite a bit that AID has done in the past, I believe continues to do at the municipal level, working with municipalities. And I do think that's an important way to work. Not for an IMF deal per se, but I do think we should be thinking again creatively and frankly leveraging the diaspora on this as well, to work directly with local municipalities. But too bad we can't do the IMF deal that way.
Yeah, let me comment on that, Ed, as well. I mean, I'm 1,000% for municipalities. I was very involved in the 90s in a national campaign to force the government to hold local elections. People sometimes think that decentralization is the opposite of central government. It's not. They kind of, go hand in hand, as it were. Decentralization, both at the regional level, which is not implemented in Lebanon, as well as empowering and invigorating the municipalities, is absolutely essential. But the country also needs a functioning central government, obviously. In the case that we're looking at today, in the economic collapse, what is desperately needed, and that can only really happen at the central level, is a very painful and very difficult agreement, negotiation as to how to deal with the tremendous losses that happened. There's a lot of billions of dollars that are not coming back. The struggle inside Lebanon is those with money and influence want to pay the least and want the population to pay the most. And so far, that's been what has been winning, because no deal has been made. Hence, the currency continues to decline. The banks continue to seize people's money and only give them small amounts. So there needs to be a much better deal to salvage what can be salvaged of people's savings. And it's then absolutely necessary to find a deal to merge, consolidate, and refloat the Lebanese banking system. That's going to require capital from abroad. That's going to require hard decisions. In order to have a functioning economy, you need a functioning banking system. Thirdly, the central bank is effectively bankrupt and there's no confidence in it. There's been resistance to an audit of the central bank. There's resistance for the head of the central bank to take any responsibility for anything that's happened. The country needs a clean sheet for the central bank, fresh leadership, and a new way forward for that central institution. Finally, the government itself, we need a government, we need a state, as it were. The budget used to be about 16 billion. It's now about 1 billion. Now there are ways maybe to save here and there, and I'm not saying everything there is essential, but the Lebanese people need a functioning Lebanese state. And that means you need to, through not just the IMF, but through international assistance and internal reforms, figure out a way to reconstruct the Lebanese public budget and rebuild Lebanese public revenues, obviously, while radically fighting corruption, so that the money that's coming in is properly spent, is not siphoned off by a corrupt political class and their cronies. So decentralization and local government is absolutely essential. But also a functioning central economy, at least functioning institutions of an economy, a banking system, a stable money, and a functioning central bank and manageable public finances are unavoidable. And Lebanon cannot do that without not only an IMF deal. Of course, it's flawed. Every deal has pros and cons. It's not going to be perfect. But will put us in the right direction. But more essentially, Lebanon needs to open up again to investment. There's billions and billions of Lebanese money that's willing to invest in Lebanon if the economy can be made to tick properly again. There's a lot of Gulf money. There's a lot of European money. There's offshore gas money. But the environment is not there to receive this money and economy growing again. And in order to get there, you do need the IMF, you do need reforms, you need to float the banking system. A lot of homework needs to be done in order to get there. Thank you, Ed.
Ed, if I could just put a fine point on something Paul just said in his last point there, and it relates to this latest Lebanese hostage crisis, I call it, the dysfunctional political class holding its own people hostage. And it's not just the crisis and the economic crisis that's upon the country right now, it's the missed opportunity. And Paul just highlighted Lebanese capital and some of the Gulf sovereign wealth funds. There, in other parts of the region right now, and this is an interesting dynamic we should all watch, is that with the increased revenues in especially Gulf countries due to the Ukraine war and the run-up in gas prices, people are looking not to offer handouts to countries. And there are other places that are slightly more functional, Egypt and other places where some of these sovereign wealth funds have gone into to try to help startups create jobs and do things like this. Paul's point is absolutely correct. And what I'm just want to highlight is that it's a missed opportunity for the Lebanese people and then the business class, because they're being held hostage by their own leaders. There is, I think, a moment of opportunity in this crisis to actually turn things. And often the discussion focuses on either US bilateral assistance or what the IMF package can do. Lebanon needs it all right now, but there could be a day if its leaders made a different choice where that vibrancy that used to exist and how you started our conversation, Ed, about what Lebanon used to be and its economy used to be, it could be a beacon, but it needs its political leaders to actually take different decisions and make different choices.
Thank you, Brian. That's very helpful. Paul, here's a question. How do we make sure municipal elections take place this year? Will they take place on time? If not, how do we ensure that?
Well, they already did not take place on time. They were supposed to happen last year. We should be aware that most people in the political class do not like municipalities or municipal elections. We should be aware of that. I think at the civil society level, I mean, as I said, I mentioned the national effort in the 1990s. There was a campaign called Baladi Baldati Baladiyati, which was a very national campaign to force the governing class to hold elections. I think civil society and any media that is halfway independent, and any members of parliament, any politicians who are of that nature as well, should make it a major issue in Lebanon. And if it's a major issue in Lebanon, then it'll appear on the international community's radar, and we'll be able to do that. Now, realistically, step one has to be electing a president. Parliament today cannot do anything before electing a president. So in order for that to happen, let's move quickly on electing a president, then forming a government, and then among the number one items that that new sort of configuration of power, other than IMF stuff and reforms, is quickly organize and hold municipal elections. It's a historic process where political change can happen at the ground level, which can then affect national politics in the parliamentary elections.
Thank you, Paul. Let me jump to a question on federalism. There seems to be a lot of proposals now floating that maybe Lebanon should become a federal state. What are the pros and cons, or any of your reactions to that?
Well, I don't want to keep jumping in, but I've worked a lot on this. I mean, to start with, Lebanon is already a kind of a federal state. It is federal in the sense that the different communities are recognized in the Constitution as constituent communities. They have ability to appeal to the Constitutional Court when laws are, run counter to their interests. They are represented in Parliament and in the main positions, for better or for worse. Many people would say for worse. That power is shared by the communities in a kind of a federal, not necessarily geographic federal way, but a communal federation. So there's a lot of federalism already built into the system to some degree. Now, some suggestions of federalism, there's a gamut of suggestions. Some of it is sort of tending towards, well, we should have more decentralization. That's already been discussed. That's already in the TAF agreement. That would definitely be a move in the right direction. Others have gone a bit more extensive to have a kind of confederal system where different regions of the country really have their own, more extensive decision-making capacity and a much weaker set of authorities in the central government. I think all of these suggestions are worth debating. The political question or challenge is that if the Lebanese, constituent, if parliament or a constituent assembly wants to, unpack the Ta'if agreement, which has prevailed since for the last 32, 33 years, that does open, I think it at some point is going to be necessary, but it opens a whole set of conversations about who wants what in the country. And federalism is one of them. Hezbollah might have other demands, and other communities might as well. I would say decentralization is the most urgent thing that needs to be done in that direction. In any federal system, you still need a central government. Switzerland has an effective central government. The United States has a very effective one. Brazil. So it's not. That's why I said we should move in decentralization and local government, but we also have to reform and rebuild our central government. There's no such thing as a state without a central government in the modern world. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I sometimes worry that this federalism concept, when it comes to Lebanon, is code for let's split the three religions up. And it does worry me about motivation. That's why I tend to think more clearly when it comes to clearly for Lebanon when it comes to decentralization. But we'll see how that all turns out. Maybe we have a non-Paul question here, Paul. But maybe the other three would like to answer our last question. and then I'll let you each say a word upon closing. What and how important is the role of the UN in addressing the wide range of challenges that Lebanon faces? I'm looking at Mona maybe first. David probably has an input, maybe even Brian.
I mean, very briefly, the UN is extremely well placed and does play a critical role, whether it's through the World Food Program, which administers a lot of the food aid, UNHCR for the refugees, UNDP and the work it does with Lebanese host communities as well as refugees. So the UN has a critical role to play, has been a key actor in all of this, and of course, you know, the UN Special Representative in Lebanon. So I think there's a lot that the UN has been doing and continues to do.
Anybody else? David or Brian? Okay, thank you very much. This has been informative for me. I've learned a lot just by listening to you. We've had a couple hundred people on this call, hopefully, that have also learned a lot from your dialogue today, and we can't thank you enough. And obviously, I want to pay a compliment to the Middle East Institute for their partnership and the way in which we're working so closely together. We're bringing really all the experts when it comes to US-Lebanon policy work together. And I think that's a real compliment to the work that Paul and you all do. So why don't we do 1 minute each? I'll start with Paul, then Mona, Brian, and David. Paul?
Yeah, I just want to, thank you, Ed, for your leadership of the American Task Force on Lebanon, everything you do for Lebanon in the US and in Washington, and for the great collaboration between our two institutions. I want to thank all the 20 people, experts who've been to many meetings and worked with us and yourself to get this report out. I want to hope that the presidential elections move forward quickly and that the choice is a solid one for a clean candidate and a nationalist candidate who can help move the country forward, not move it backward. But that's all for me. Thank you, Ed.
Ed, I'm going to jump in, though you're muted. So just again, add my thanks as well to this tremendous effort. And 3 quick points. One is just to underscore that the notion that Lebanon is in a political stalemate sort of seems to convey the idea of stasis. It's not. It really, this translates to a precipitous decline in humanitarian conditions. We can't forget that. Secondly, and for all those on the call, how important it is for the diaspora to play a role in this. We are in the search for creative, innovative solutions. I think AID continues to be interested in thinking through how to catalyze the diaspora, but I do think that's a critical source going forward for kind of the way forward for Lebanon. And third, Paul's one of his later interventions made me realize I want to underscore too the degree to which there is quite a lot of misinformation about Syrian refugees, and I think it's really incumbent to battle that misinformation. And I hope, Ed, that a study group that stood up will take that on as one of its first tasks, is to separate between fact and fiction and do some myth busting on this so that we can clear a way forward. Thanks, and thanks again so much to both ATFL and MEI.
Thank you, Mona. Brian?
There you go. I did what you did, Ed. I was muted, sorry. 3 quick points. One, just in and of itself, the need for a bipartisan support and continued US engagement in Lebanon to support the Lebanese people. It's a key part of a piece of the puzzle for stability in the broader Middle East. Second, Lebanon is I think, a key component in what I think the Biden administration should do, which is rethink its approach to Iran in the broader region, right? And the Biden team has essentially said that their efforts on the nuclear negotiations have not succeeded, but they haven't developed a plan B. And to me, Lebanon should be treated in and of itself and the Lebanese people as the priority, but clearly it's an arena in which Iran and its partners like Hezbollah play a role. And part of any counter strategy or alternative strategy needs to include Lebanon. And then lastly, it should, any US approach should be not just focused on the threats and the risks, and there are many, as we've all talked about here, but there should be also an articulation of what the opportunities are, something I call for the Middle East, the silver linings playbook. If that sounds a bit ridiculous or farcical today, but I think it's important to have that as an ideal, just to hold out the hope that I think many Lebanese people have, and the aspiration that they have for something different than what their political leaders are providing for them now. And it seems so far away, but I actually do believe with the right types of support and the right decisions by their leaders in Lebanon, they could actually move in the right direction. So thanks, Ed.
Thank you, David.
I think that it's important to be idealistic, but also in our goals, but realistic in our expectations. And the reason there's a vacancy in Lebanon isn't because people are bad or don't know how to govern Lebanon. It's because there's a sharp difference of opinion that is a chasm, actually, of ideology and orientation. And so if we want Lebanon to rebuild and stabilize, we have to allow compromises to occur that can then lead to the right choices. So I would emphasize that, and I would underscore the need for American diplomacy to not be just crisis oriented, but steady and engaged over time. And third, I agree we need to approach Lebanon on its own merits, but we also need to engage Saudi Arabia and Iran as key factors that influence behavior inside Lebanon as well, if we want to change the situation. Back to you, Ed.
Thank you. Well, let me just say thank you to Paul for your leadership. Mona, special thanks. She's the one that created the original Lebanon Working Group. Brian for doing a lot of the work on this paper. And welcome to David for now joining the rest of us downtown. And we look forward, David, to having you in this group. So thank you all very much. And thank you to all of those who participated.